My name is Brian Tremail, and I am with the Associated General Contractors of America. I want to thank folks for logging in. Before we get started, I just want to let you know that for the reporters on today's virtual media event, we will be emailing out a news release with links to all the material we're discussing today. We're also recording this event, and we'll make it available for folks after the fact as well. With that, I'd like to go ahead and start things off with remarks from AGC of America's chief economist, Ken Simonson. So Ken, I'm going to hand it to you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Brian, for that introduction. As the new April employment figures make clear, the coronavirus has had a devastating impact on the construction industry. Construction employment declined by 975,000 jobs between March and April, or 13% of the industry's total workforce. By far, this is the worst ever one-month decline in construction employment. As a result of these job losses, unemployment among workers with recent construction experience soared by 1.1 million from a year earlier to more than 1.5 million workers, while the unemployment rate in construction jumped from 4.7% in April of 2019 to 16.6% last month. Unlike many other segments of the economy, relatively few of the construction industry's job losses have to do with government-mandated economic shutdowns. Indeed, our association and its chapters worked with federal, state, and local officials to ensure that construction activities were deemed essential and allowed to proceed under new safety operating procedures in most of the country. Instead, as the results of a new survey of construction firms we are releasing today make clear, the pandemic is prompting many construction owners to halt projects out of fear or economic necessity. While the share of firms that report projects have been halted by government order declined from 35% of respondents 2 weeks ago to 30% this week, now 37% of respondents say their clients have voluntarily directed them to halt work out of fears of the pandemic. 31% report owners have canceled projects because of a predicted reduction in demand, and 21% report having projects canceled as a result of a loss of private funding. 2/3 of firms report having a project canceled or delayed since the start of the outbreak in early March. These cancellations have forced many firms to cut staff. 39% report cutting staff between March 1st and May 1st. So that is an implication that the Labor Department figures, which were collected during the week of April 12th, will get even worse by the May report. Those job losses would have been even more severe had it not been for the federal government's Paycheck Protection Program loans. 80% of respondents report having applied for the loans. The vast majority of these applicants were approved and have received the funds. Unfortunately, recent announcements by the Treasury Department, revisions to its guidance for those loans, have prompted quite a few construction employers to continue returning those funds. 18% of firms in our survey report they are considering returning their loans because of the vague new Treasury guidance, which threatens prosecution for firms not qualifying or not using the funds as directed. Many of these firms will be forced to lay off staff after they return the funds, while a lucky few are among the 20% of firms who report having picked up new projects, including expanding healthcare facilities since the outbreak began. These new doubts about the federal loan program are one reason why 12% of firms report they anticipate they will need to cut staff during the next 4 weeks. Even as the economic slowdown and red tape put construction jobs at risk, there are signs that some aspects of the industry are stabilizing. For instance, while 4 weeks ago, 39% of firms reported having to delay work on projects because of shortages of personal protective equipment, including masks, that number fell from 39% to 28% this week. Delays caused by shortages of craft workers and government personnel, such as inspectors, also fell slightly compared to a few weeks ago. It is important to note that the impacts of the coronavirus have not been uniform. When we break the survey results out by region, we see that job losses were particularly severe in the Northeast, where 53% of respondents terminated or furloughed employees. The South had the fewest firms reporting staff reductions, 29%, while 38% of firms in the Midwest and 45% in the West reduced headcount. Surveys like ours offer an important look at how the industry is being impacted by the coronavirus, but it is always good to have multiple sources of data to validate our findings. Fortunately, AGC's partner and construction software provider Procore has found another way to capture in near real time the impacts of the coronavirus on the construction industry. As the next speaker, Chris Langiza, Procore's Senior Director of Business Development, will explain, their data is based on the transactions logged via their software by tens of thousands of construction companies across the country. Procore's data provides very specific, localized, and credible ways to measure what is happening to the construction industry as the pandemic and related lockdown take their toll on the economy. Chris, why don't you walk us through your data?
Thanks a lot, Ken. Really appreciate that introduction and very happy to share the information that we've been able to capture here at Procore. For those of you who don't know Procore, we are a construction management platform that is used around the globe, and our vision has always really been to improve the lives of everyone in construction. And that's why we think it is so important that we share this data, is so that our customers and the industry can make decisions on how to proceed with their businesses based on more real-time information and more real-time data. We will continue to update this data regularly and continue to add additional findings as we have them. For many of you who are familiar with, how the country came about with our shelter-in-place orders, you'll notice that early on, as much as the week of March 15th, those shelter-in-place orders started to go in place, being led by California and some of the other states. But what will be important to notice here is how this information goes ahead and correlates with the slowdown in the worker hours that have been being logged through Procore. As we discuss the effects on projects across the country, you'll notice that California was one of the first states to shelter in place in that week of March 15th, and you'll see the immediate effects as we dive a little bit deeper. You'll also know that about 50% of the nation's population was actually under shelter in place orders after that second cohort went into place. So Procore captures these worker hours through the trades and the collaborators that are leveraging our platform out in the field on projects. It allows us to give near real-time information of how many worker hours are being logged on projects really across the United States. And one thing you'll notice is that leading up into COVID, we were represented by a strong economy and the construction season coming online with a peak measurement of about 14 million worker hours in that week of March 1st. We will use that as our bench line to measure against as we measure the decline in worker hours as we go deeper and deeper into shelter in place, and also we go deeper and deeper into the time that we've been dealing with COVID. You'll see that correlation and decline in worker hours as additional cohorts go into shelter in place in the weeks of the March 15th, March 22nd, and March 29th. And week over week, we see those decreases go down until the week of April 5th, where we start to see a slight uptick, which we believe is correlated to the PPP programs that Ken mentioned earlier. We also noticed that there has been a significant leveling off of this decline of workers since the week of April 12th, holding at about 12 million on average worker hours in place being put on place in projects, which puts us at a place with an overall current worker stand about 13% below our pre-COVID benchmark, truly highlighting a bit of the resilience that we have had on some projects. So as we start to dive into this data a little bit more across the states and the municipalities that we have here, you'll notice that these next few charts will represent the changes that happened, and as different parts of the country put in place shelter-in-place orders, how they were affected. Early on, noticing that California, as they put in those early shelter-in-place orders, really dropped drastically in that week of March 15th before they had determined whether or not construction could be considered essential. You'll also see that these hotspots are continuing to evolve as the hotspots of places where we are seeing higher intensity of COVID cases. And those construction reductions align with that. As you'll notice, there was a slight uptick from the week here before where California had deemed construction essential. As we move through the weeks here, and these graphics will be available on that website, so if you'd like to dive in more into the data, you're more than welcome to do this. You'll see how different parts of the country and how they handled those shelter-in-place orders, and how some of them were actually starting to increase a little bit as of that April 12th week when some of those PPP programs came into place. We'll also notice that parts of the United States, such as the South, were started to represent where some of those lighter restrictions were starting to take place, and we're starting to see some of that work come back online as they have begun to put businesses back online in those portions of the country as well. Now, one of the hypotheses that we had prior to this was that smaller contractors, our smaller customers, would be more greatly affected by COVID than others. And so we wanted to validate that hypothesis. And what we did is we tested that. We separated the users of our platform into 3 buckets: small, medium, and large companies. We did definitely see a significantly greater effect in worker hours for those smaller companies, as you can see by the blue line running along the bottom. We did also notice that medium companies were more highly affected than large companies at the beginning, but they have come back to close the gap between those large companies. We believe that many of this is because it took them a little bit longer to mobilize programs, to get plans in place on how to keep those construction projects up and running. And once they got on board with that, they were able to keep more and more projects and more work going. Now, the other hypothesis that we had was that we wanted to test that infrastructure was whether or not it was a little bit more resilient than non-infrastructure type work. So in order to do this, we went through our database and tagged project types on whether or not they were infrastructure or non-infrastructure type work. And what we validated was that there really was not that much of a difference between those 2 different project types, and that COVID is disruptive across the board to construction, whether or not you are working on infrastructure projects or non-infrastructure projects. And you can see how closely these 2 lines correlate throughout that timeline. Now, we wanted to dive a little bit deeper. So we did that by diving into the different types of infrastructure projects. You can notice here that we split them down into 4 separate categories: transportation, healthcare and energy, and then non-infrastructure types projects. And as the country started to turn their focus to COVID conversion type projects, we actually saw that healthcare was the most resilient, even seeing an uptick as in those weeks in early April to mid-April, where a lot of those conversion projects were coming online, and we are seeing our customers pitch in to make those stadium and venue conversions happen so that we could leverage that. So you can see that overall, definitely a downturn for these markets, but therefore healthcare was slightly more resilient than the other types of projects. Now, as mentioned before by Brian and Ken, much of this information is made available to you as the industry. We have built a website specifically for this, procore.com/COVID insights, where you can dive deeper into the data and information that is here. And also, we look forward to continuing the conversation with you on our community. That is a place where we can continue to have the conversation. We are looking for feedback on more data that you would like to see, and we look for any and all feedback that you would like to give to us. So please reach out to us and let us know, as we will be releasing regular updates to this data and also adding additional data findings in the future as they become available. Thanks, Ken, and I'll turn it back over to you.
All right. Well, thanks, Chris. I'm very excited about this new data source. I think it gives us a lot more detail at the state level, by segment, by company size, and the fact that you were able to trace things week by week from the beginning of March, I think will really help us, as well as media, policymakers, and others, understand what specifically is happening with construction on a more timely basis than what we get out of the monthly government data. And I'm also encouraged by the fact that your numbers are quite consistent with what we saw in the BLS report, that your measurement of hours of decline, the decrease in hours since the beginning of March up specifically to the middle of April, which is when the government took its snapshot of employment, very similar decline. And so I'm really looking forward to further iterations and variations on this data. Today's jobs report along with our new survey results and Procore's data, make it clear that the construction industry is not immune to the economic damage being inflicted on our country by the virus. Yet it is also clear that federal officials can and should take additional steps to avoid additional layoffs and economic hardship. For instance, the Treasury Department needs to clarify its guidance regarding the Paycheck Protection Program so firms better understand what the agency means when it says firms should not accept the funds if they have access to other sources of credit. Does that include corporate credit cards? And how will the Treasury Department treat lines of credit that construction companies are required to keep open to meet federal bonding requirements? In addition, 61% of our respondents say Congress should enact a safe harbor set of protocols to provide firms that are following safe practices with protection from tort or employment liability for failing to prevent a COVID-19 infection. 43% of firms in the survey also hope for a larger federal investment in infrastructure, which will be especially vital as budget constraints force many state and local officials to curtail capital expenditures for the foreseeable future. And 32% of firms say they would like Washington to enact a COVID-19 Business and Employee Continuity and Recovery Fund. An equal share want Congress to fill state highway transportation department's immediate $50 billion funding gap that came from the sharp drop in taxes, toll revenues, and other sources dedicated to highway projects. The U.S. economy can recover once the coronavirus passes and the economic impacts are lifted. But without safe harbor provisions, new infrastructure investments, and a recovery fund, it is hard to see a scenario where that recovery will start for the construction industry anytime soon. With that, we'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
There are already a couple of questions that are in the queue, but if for those of you who haven't had a chance to ask a question yet, if you go to your control bar, which I think on most computers is located at the bottom, that's where you find, you'll see an option for Q&A. Just type in your question there and we'll do our best to answer as many questions. And I'm going to try and take these in the order that they arrived, and I'm going to let Ken and Chris kind of split up how they want to answer them. The first question is, are construction materials experiencing price declines, and is that helping the industry at all, or where do we see construction materials prices going? And I know, Ken, you've got some insight, and Chris, I don't know if you've got data on that. Go ahead, Ken.
Yes, there's certainly high frequency data on this, at least indirect. For instance, we see oil prices, copper futures every day on commodities markets, and those have had dramatic declines. Crude oil futures, as is widely reported, are now down more than 60%. At one point, actually went negative for one very specific kind of contract. That isn't what construction firms would be paying. They're buying a lot of diesel fuel, though, to operate their own trucks and off-road equipment, and to get deliveries of materials and equipment, and then hauling away dirt, debris, and equipment at the end of the job. So the decline in diesel prices, which the Energy Information Administration says is 77 cents from a year ago to this Monday, that really is an important saving. Gasoline down more than $1 a gallon over the past year. In terms of things specific to construction, such as steel, some forms of copper, and concrete, we have seen big drops in the globally traded commodities such as steel and copper, things that are produced locally and used specifically in construction. Not yet much price movement, but I expect we'll be seeing that. And we will be getting the producer price indexes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics for prices in mid-April. That'll be out next Wednesday, and we'll have an analysis of that.
I have to learn to unmute. And Chris, I don't know if you had anything that you could share on materials prices, if that's part of the data you guys collect.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I can add much more color than Ken did there, so I think he did a great job with that one.
Fantastic. All right, the next one, and here, Chris, I think your local data will come in handy. KXL in Portland, Oregon was just hoping for, and I think both of you can answer this, but why don't we start with you, Chris? Just a little bit of your observations on what's going on in the Pacific Northwest, Oregon, Washington, kind of what's your read, what's the data telling you about how things are going in that part of the country?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, from a high level, we saw that part of the country get highly impacted, especially very early on. And you'll look at some of the maps that we show there, that they will be some of the deeper colors that we show there, with a higher percentage of slowdowns and reduction in worker hours. The positive things is, as recently as April 26th, those numbers have reduced significantly. We're all the way back to about 21% down from that March, which is a significant improvement from what we were seeing early on when they began their shelter in place. Some numbers as low as 50 or 55% down from previously. So there is an improvement happening in that Pacific Northwest, especially up in the Washington area, from what we're seeing on those projects. And so that's promising from our perspective. Ken, I'd love for you to share a little bit more color.
Yeah, I think that you nailed it, that Washington State had one of the first really bad outbreaks, and they acted very aggressively. I think we will see more reopening, but I don't expect construction, particularly from private owners, to open up very much. I think we will see a lot of renovation going on, and certainly there has been some emergency work to deal with the virus. In terms of new construction, I think that's going to be limited to some categories like distribution facilities. So many more things are being delivered to people's homes now, and that distribution chain is quite different from what goes to restaurants, stores, and offices, that you really need to see some new delivery facilities. In addition, so much more use of the internet to bring in work, education, entertainment into homes, that I expect some more build out of things like fiber optic cable, cell towers, maybe data centers, maybe 5G. But for the most part, I think private owners are going to say, we have to see what the demand is for our facilities, for the facilities that we have now and ones that we wanted to build. And we also have to see what our financial situation is. Similarly, with state and local governments, they're taking a hit on just about all of their revenue sources. They face balanced budget requirements that mean that they're going to be looking for savings. And unfortunately for our industry, it's usually easier to defer or cancel a construction project that hasn't begun than to cut existing spending or payments to employees or to beneficiaries.
Thank you, Ken. There's another question, and I may answer it, but Ken, obviously, if you want to jump in, and Chris, feel free. Have there been any discussions with lawmakers on how the PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program loan, the guidance has changed, the changes to the guidance and lack of clarity have hurt the industry, and any belief that that the Treasury Department will change their guidance between now and the 14th or later? You talked on the data behind that, and maybe we'll circle back to that. But the broader answer to the question is yes. America has been very involved with conversations with the Treasury Department, the White House, the administration about the challenges that the Treasury's guidance has placed on construction firms, and explain some of the unique characteristics and some of the unique credit many construction firms have, especially public or firms that do public work, that are at kind of odds with the guidance Treasury issued. And we're doing everything we can to get them to clarify. And at this point, though, I don't know if we can make a prediction of whether they will fix that guidance by the 14th of May, which is their deadline for loans to be returned, or after that. And I don't know, Ken and Chris, if you don't want to wade into it, totally understand. But I don't know, Ken, if they're want to go back to the data that shows some of the problems with the guidance.
Yeah, I think we're fortunate that our members are very tuned into policy developments. They jumped on this PPP program immediately, and as noted in our latest survey, 80% of firms who answered the survey said that they had already been approved for the loans. Nearly all of them had gotten the funding, but they also are paying attention to these ever-evolving guidances and reports out of the Treasury and the SBA, the Small Business Administration. So as we noted, 18% of the firms said that they are considering returning the PPP loans, even though they felt that they had legitimately qualified for the funds and had gotten them. And then we also have some firms that say they're considering withdrawing a PPP loan application. Now, many of those firms, unfortunately, say they would have to lay off employees if those things happen. So this is really an important set of guidance that we're looking for from the Treasury, and the industry has been vocal about what it means to them.
Chris, I'm going to assume you want to take a pass on this one, but
yeah, I'll take a pass there.
That's fine, absolutely fine. A technical question, and I think this is more for Chris. Just define small, medium, and large companies. How many job sites data in each state? And I know that varies quite a bit. And how many job site data in each sector? Infrastructure, non-infrastructure, healthcare, et cetera. Maybe just a flavor behind the data.
Happy to provide a bit more color there. So as far as we defined small, medium, and large businesses, we deemed anything less than $20 million a year in annual construction volume as a small business. Those who fell between $20 and $200 million would be a medium business, and those who were greater than $200 million a year, it would be a large business. So as you look at the data on our site, you'll be able to see there's some footnote in there to give you a little bit more definition on those. To give you a concept of how much data is actually inside of the reports, a couple of notes to be here. When we were at our peak of about 14 million worker hours, if you were looking kind of an average of about a 35-hour worker week, you'll notice that there's about 400,000 workers represented in the report as we're looking at that. And that really is spread across the nation in nearly 200,000 total projects. There's a lot of reporting that is there. That is a lot of companies that are reporting into this data. I can't give it to you by state because there is not necessarily one state is going to have so many, and then there'll be less projects happening in another. So it's a little bit difficult for us to discern, or tell you exactly how much information is in each state individually. But it is a significant batch of data that is representative of the overall market.
Brian, I know that we had a number of questions relating to the Northeast or specific states there. And as I mentioned, we did in our survey break out responses from the 4 census regions. And we had by far the steepest number of declines coming out of firms in the Northeast in terms of expected job cuts. But beyond that, I don't think we can break it out more finely into the types of contractors or projects in the Northeast or individual states there. But we do have the full set of survey answers for each of the 4 regions if some of the reporters want to go to the documentation we have.
And I don't know if, Chris, you had any observations on New England area states based on the data that you guys are collecting. Share.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, some of them are more dense than others, for sure, around where we have data. The bigger metropolitan areas have more projects going on, and then the smaller, more rural areas of the country have less, like the Vermonts and New Hampshires and things like that. Overall, that was a very, very hard hit area of the country as our data correlates to. But similar to Washington area, we're starting to see some of those numbers level off a bit there, which is promising.
Fantastic, thank you. And then we'll start with Ken, who loves to make predictions. What is for those of you who know him that he doesn't, what is the prediction for the industry in the 3rd and 4th quarters of 2020? And let's call it right now, can construction stage a comeback during COVID-19?
Well, I'm a chronic optimist, and most situations, but unfortunately, I just think that the financial situation for the owners, as we call them, the clients for construction projects, is not going to warrant their doing new construction for quite some time, with the few exceptions I mentioned relating to distribution, communication, related construction. I guess one other area to highlight is that I think many employers will choose or perhaps be forced by government directive to do extensive renovations of existing properties, whether it's offices, stadiums, and other entertainment venues. I think there's going to be a lot more checking on the health of workers and perhaps customers and visitors coming into those sites. So this may be a boon to contractors that are used to doing interior renovations, remodeling, and so forth. And we may see more construction companies shifting their focus from new construction into those kinds of projects. I don't know, Chris, do your data allow you to separate those kinds of work?
I think it could certainly allow us to in the future. I mean, I'm not in a position to make a prediction. I'm not in the prediction game. So, I'll leave that to some of the upcoming dashboards that I think we'll be releasing around some of that data may provide some additional insight into where we're going and where the projects are going in the future. So stay tuned for more of those coming out as our data teams are working on those heavily right now.
Great.
Thank you, Chris and Ken. Another question. To what extent have either of you been able to track job losses at large industrial projects that have, sort of significant impact on the overall numbers? The example that the questioner noted was the Shell cracker project in Pennsylvania that had 3,000 workers, but we also see some reductions in staffing at the Vogel plant down in Georgia and other things. Is that the kind of data that, A, Ken, are you tracking it? B, is that the kind of data that Procore has access to? So maybe we'll start with Ken and then go to Chris.
Yeah, we don't compile that ourselves or get it through the surveys, but I certainly keep an eye on news accounts. Another area that Brian, was hit very hard, Lake Charles, Louisiana. We do a monthly tabulation of construction employment change from 1 year earlier when the BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics, puts out that data for 358 metro areas. And Lake Charles had the dubious honor of having the largest numerical loss in jobs from March of 2019 to March of 2020, and the second largest percentage loss of any of those 358 metro areas. And that was largely before the coronavirus hit. But in recent weeks, we've also heard that some huge liquefied natural gas processing plants and export terminal projects have been put on hold, have not moved to the final investment decision stage. And that's a function, of course, in the huge drop in demand for natural gas because of dropping economic activity around the world.
And Chris, I don't know if you guys have any data on those sort of large industrial plants that's worth commenting on.
Yeah, we're not trying to zero in on specifically those. A lot of that number is going to be rolled up into that energy number that I was talking about as we broke out those industries that are impacted more heavily, in transportation, healthcare, energy. So we are seeing representation of them in the data set, but we're not singling in specifically on industrial or a specific project. It's more of as an overall umbrella.
Gotcha. Another question here, and this goes, I think, a little bit to the sort of regional differences, but, what sense do either of you have on how the pandemic is affecting the construction industry in different ways based on whether the states have a stay-at-home order or not? Is that something that you guys could talk about a little bit?
Well, I can say, looking at our regional data, while the South had the least decline, the least number of government-ordered project shutdowns or owners deciding to cut back, by the same token, we're seeing a little more optimism, a little more ordering of new projects or of companies saying they have or plan to rehire workers in the other regions. So a smaller dip, smaller recovery for the South, certainly a bigger drop-off, particularly as we've mentioned in the Northeast. We'll just have to see if that bounce back does happen in those regions. But I do think that the Procore figures that Chris showed us have some clear state-by-state differences and some connection to the shutdown orders that have taken place. We'll see if the reopening corresponds to an increase in construction hours. Obviously, it's different from reopening a restaurant or a barber shop and seeing those businesses say, okay, we want to go ahead with construction.
Yeah, absolutely, Ken. And I think, the maps that we've shared give that same story, right? Which is that the South had somewhat leaner restrictions or lighter restrictions on the work, so they didn't dip nearly as low. And they're seeing some of that rebound as well. You can see that in the maps as recently as April 12th and April 19th, those weeks there. And then similarly, kind of in the Northwest, the Montanas, the Idahos, and some of those things, how they are coming online a little bit out of their winter season, right? So some planned construction or some projects that were potentially going to start picking up, we're seeing some increases there as well. And that could be a seasonal change as well in those areas.
Great,
I'd mentioned one category that would be interesting to watch is what happens with highway construction. Very early on, there were some reports, particularly the Florida DOT, saying contractors could go ahead and work longer hours, close more lanes because road traffic was so light. A few weeks later, the Indiana DOT announced huge rebuilding project of the interstates in Indianapolis, I think, for the same reason, but there may also have been motivation to help provide a little economic stimulus. However, offsetting that, and I fear it will be more of a drag than these small examples of increased activity, huge drop in fuel tax revenue, so that going forward, many DOTs are going to be paring back their bid lettings, as we call them, the days in which they award contracts for new construction. That's why we think it's so important that Congress step up right away and backfill those holes in the DOT budgets.
Gotcha. Thank you, Ken and Chris. Another question, and I'll take the first stab, and if you guys want to jump in, please do. Many experts say there will be a second wave, presumably of the coronavirus. What adjustments is the industry making to protect workers from the coronavirus now and moving forward? And indeed, I think one of the reasons that the federal officials and so many state governors and mayors and county officials were identified construction as essential and allowed it to continue in many parts of the country is because they understand that the construction industry has got a long proven track record of following complex and ever-changing safety procedures. We've seen that exactly with the coronavirus. We've seen firms really change the way they staff their operations. And in fact, we've heard anecdotally from many members and that the productivity levels on the projects has changed dramatically, or less productive as they work to adjust in the way they operate. But certainly firms are no longer doing briefings or gatherings. They're briefing online, or they're briefing in groups that are small and distance at least 6 feet. They've had to change the way they schedule shifts and stagger the work. They've had to change entrance and exit procedures. They've had to look at making sure that not everyone has a break at the same time or lunch at the same time, because most sites don't have the luxury of a big break area, and they want to make sure people aren't crowding. Obviously, in most parts of the country, firms are required to wear masks, and whenever contractors can't socially distance their workers, they're wearing masks and other what we call PPE, personal protective equipment. They're disinfecting high-touch areas. They're putting in place more hand sanitizing stations and requiring it. They're changing how many people can ride in the lifts, the construction elevators, so they're only at about 10 or 15% capacity. A lot of firms will carpool workers to and from parking lots and job sites, especially in urban areas. So they've reduced the number of people in the carpools, required the windows to be open. So just about every element of the way projects are built has been altered make sure that the firms are protecting their workers from the coronavirus, and more important, protecting the broader community from the spread of the coronavirus. And as Steve Sander, the CEO of AGC of America, has made the case to the administration that construction is the model to emulate as we look to rebuild the economy, one of the things we've learned is that you have to constantly reinforce and enforce those new safety procedures. Our member firms have been doing regular safety stand downs and safety briefings because old habits do die hard, and we're going to find this as more parts of the economy open up. And you've got to constantly tell folks that no, it's not okay to congregate, or yes, you have to wear that mask, or no, you can't share tools, and be willing to send folks home who aren't following those guidelines. And I don't know if maybe those changes in productivity have shown up in any of the data that Ken or Chris are looking at, but certainly this industry has taken an enormous number of steps to protect workers and the public.
Right, and we did ask early in we've now done 6 of these surveys. Early on, we were asking what steps firms had taken, and it was such a high participation rate on each of the things you mentioned that we felt there was no need to keep documenting that firms had already stepped up.
Yeah, I'll add a little bit of color to that. From as a former industry professional, like I am so have been so promising about the efforts that everyone I've talked to in the industry has taken to protect their workers. As you mentioned earlier, Brian, like construction has been in a place where we've had to enforce safety regulations on our job sites for a very long time. So this is not new to us. And they've become really innovative and have done a great job of rolling out procedures that allow them to keep workers safe and keep the work going. And that's always been one of our commitments as well, is to make sure that we are keeping people safe. We are making sure jobs keep going. And that's why we've made it easier for our people to document and not just put in place those practices, but also document them in case there's any question. If there's a limit of the number of people on the job site, can you document how many people were actually there? And it's just a really promising the way that people have leaned into it. And I think it'll actually drive long-term change in our industry over a period of time.
Thanks, Chris and Ken. Here's an interesting question, and I don't know if any of our data gets to this, but are we seeing differences in job losses between management, or what we call sort of, salaried construction professionals, and craft employees, or hourly construction professionals, as we call them? And I don't know if we're seeing any distinction in the layoffs between those sort of 2 types of professionals.
We asked a few weeks ago about job losses, or the percentage of firms that had reduced job site employment versus other employment. But I can't say that we've got enough detail to go into that further.
Yeah, I would say similarly, Brian. I'm not sure that we've dug deep enough into the detail there to have an opinion yet, or to provide any data, but something for us to definitely take as consideration as we look at more data to be able to provide to the industry.
And Brian, as you well know, we do a workforce availability summer survey late each summer, and we haven't decided on what that should look like this time, but we do separately get information on a lot of different salaried positions and 20 different crafts. So perhaps that's something we would have some information on by the end of the summer.
Another question, and this is addressed to Chris, is Procore seeing any correlation between worker hours and project performance, both in terms of financial performance of a project and the schedule health?
Yeah, it's a great question, and this is an area of high level of interest to us, obviously, and our teams are definitely looking deep into this. I'm not in a position to present any of that data today, but as I mentioned, with more regular updates and more dashboards being able to come out in the future, this is something that we are definitely keeping a close eye on. And with the massive data set that we have available to us around some of those performance metrics that those projects can be measured by, our team is definitely looking into that right now.
Thanks, Chris. That's great. And then we'll just take one last question and then wrap things up. The questioner was just curious if we had any data or wanted to elaborate on what we're seeing in the logistics distribution facility or data center construction numbers? Is that a growth area still for the industry, or are we seeing a drop in demand?
My best source on that is the Census Bureau's construction spending put in place series, but that has a longer lag. We only got March figures at the beginning of May. We'd really need to see the April numbers that are going to come out on the 1st of June to have a sense of how that's going.
Chris, I don't know if you've got any data on that.
Yeah, I don't know that we have segmented to that level, to be honest with you. Something that definitely we can talk to our teams about for sure, but we kept it a little bit at a higher level than that.
Gotcha. Well, we've had a lot of great questions. We've tried to answer about all of them. I will say, we'll ask Ken and Chris to maybe sort of, share any parting thoughts. And among those, there were a couple questions on, and I know you mentioned it before, Chris, just tell us a little bit about when additional data will become available, how can folks find it? And then if you have any other observations, why don't we start with Chris, then we'll go with Ken, and then we'll let folks get on with their Fridays.
Yeah, absolutely. Our goal in making this data available and presenting today is to make it available to the industry. So as I mentioned earlier, procore.com/COVID insights, it's live now. You can see all of the slides that I've presented today, including all of the detailed narrative on each one of those data points. So please go there and check it out. We will be updating that regularly, not just updating the weekly data, because we know that there's somewhat of a delay in time that the worker data is sometimes collected on the job site, but we'll also be adding additional insights in the future. And if you have things that you'd like us to be taking a look at that you think would be really meaningful and important, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We really are looking forward to that feedback. You can email us at press@procore.com, or in addition to that, you can go onto our community and join the conversation and provide us some feedback. We'd love to hear it.
And I just give a plug for a couple of upcoming things that we have. As I mentioned, the Bureau of Labor Statistics will put out producer price index data for April next Wednesday. We always look at 60 or 70 of the indexes that relate to construction materials, and also what contractors say they would charge to put up 5 kinds of new non-residential buildings. And we will be providing an analysis of that. 2 weeks from today, BLS will put out information on construction employment in each state, and we'll again rank all of the states by change in construction employment in the 12 months and the latest month up through April. And we may have a press event on that, and I think we'll probably have another set of survey results 2 weeks from today as well. And then finally, I'm acting as a liaison to the Census Bureau to gather information from the private sector on what kinds of construction data they would like, how they'd like it presented, and I'd be glad to hear from anybody on what they would like to see different coming from the Census Bureau relating to construction.
Great. And Chris, before we wrap up, someone just asked if you could repeat the web address for the data.
Yeah, no problem. It's procore.com//COVID, COVID -insights, INSIGHTS.
Well, Ken and Chris, thank you so much for spending part of your day with us and answering so many questions and sharing this data. Hopefully the next time we get together, we'll have more promising economic data to talk about, and largely that will be because we are seeing some supportive measures coming out of Washington, D.C. But for those of you who've been logging in, all this information is available on AGC of America's website at www.agc.org. And if we didn't get to your question, or if you have additional ones, feel free to contact me and I'll make sure we find the right person to answer your question. Again, I'm Brian Termail. Easiest way to reach me is by email, Brian, BRIAN, .Termail, TURMAIL, @agc.org. And thank you everyone so much for joining us. With that, we're going to sign off.